6 of DMD100, Intro to Digital Media Design. How's everybody doing? All right, so what are we doing this week? Let's go down to the week 6 module in Canvas, and we'll go over here to the overview and we'll take a look. So our major theme this week is, of course, one of our visual literacy areas of the 8 that we are covering. This week we're going to take a closer look and have a discussion about the idea of artistic representation. Artistic representation talks about sort of visual style, elements of art and design, artistic choices, as well as artistic media that is used. And so you can, of course, be you could have the same subject matter for 5 different projects. But if each project is done using a different media, if one's done in film, if one's done in watercolor, if one is done digitally, if one is done in crayon, you're going to get obviously different results because the media that you're using has a say in how it looks. Furthermore, the way in which those artistic choices are employed, which is based on sort of skill and experience of the artist or of the filmmaker or of whoever, the designer, whatever, that's going to have an effect on it. So anyway, in a minute, we're going to go over some examples of artistic representation and just sort of talk about how that plays a role in what we see visually, and of course represents a set of tools that you as a content creator can use. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. There's a video to watch this week. There's a consumable. This is just a quick draw, which comes from the folks over at Marvel. I love quick draws because the time-lapse video, and of course there are thousands of these out on the internet now, whether you're talking YouTube or TikTok or whatever, they're all over the place. But it's really a good way to sort of see how ideas get from somebody's head onto a surface and how they make some artistic choices along the way. Okay, so before we get into artistic representation, the only thing I want to remind you of and kind of go over a little bit of the nuance about it is this week you're going to be working on, it's not due this week, you'll notice that nothing is due this week, so that's good news, but you are going to be working on step 3 of your semester project. Now, if you remember, step 2 over here from the handout was to create a collection of content that you will find both inspiring toward your semester project and that you could possibly use in your semester project, your final deliverable, of course, being your title sequence. And we went over a little bit about what title sequences are specifically, just so we're all on the same page, and went over some examples. But the main thing of step 2 is that you were going to collect everything from video clips to photographs to graphics, figure out color palettes, some font choices, maybe some music or sound clips, all from various places. I gave you some options of places you can go look. So right now you should have a digital folder full of stuff. That was step 2 that you've already turned in and gotten credit for. Well, now step 3 is related to step 2 in that you are going to make a presentation of that research. Now, this is not just a repeat of what we did in step 2. It's not just a matter of taking what you've already collected and just saying, here it is again. Instead, you're going to create a mood board, which means you're going to curate some of that content that you've collected. You're going to go through it and you're going to say, okay, these photographs really all seem to fit well together and they're inspiring me, and I think I'm going to use those toward my final title sequence, so let me put those together, and this video clip goes with it, and maybe I'm going to go with this type of music or these types of sound effects. So now you're going through that sort of pile of stuff, that collection of stuff that you made, and really trying to make some decisions about it now to create a mood board that's going to sort of serve as the thematic representation of what you will be creating. Now, this is important for 2 reasons. Number 1, it gives you a chance to sort of be critical about what you've collected and make some visual and audio decisions. But it also serves as kind of an outline for what we can expect to see later on when you get to your actual title sequence. So if your mood board shows that you're going with sort of brightly colored daylight photographs and really sunny, upbeat music and crisp, easy to read typography, and then you later turn in a title sequence that's sort of dark and moody and scary, well, they're not going to match. They're not going to make any sense. And so when we're creating visual content, of course, we go through various iterations or drafts. And while we're keeping it pretty simple for this assignment, it is important to sort of plan what you're going to do and then do what you plan, right? So that's what this presentation is really all about. So you're going to curate, which is basically making intelligent decisions about the stuff that you've collected, and you're going to put it together into a presentation. Now you can use either PowerPoint or Google Slides or Keynote or anything else you'd like. You could use Prezi, you could use any other presentation tool that you would like, whatever you're comfortable with. I'm not picky about it. Make sure that in your presentation of this research, you remind us which classic movie or TV show that you chose. Remind us which new genre and subgenre that you imagined it into. And then you're going to try to answer some of these questions in showing us this work, right? Now, you can answer these questions by writing out the answers. You can write a couple of short paragraphs about these to go along with your presentation. That would probably be the easiest, but you can also demonstrate it to us in how you put together the presentation. So this is a little bit sort of open-ended and gives you a chance to really put some creativity into this presentation. So again, don't just slap together your content, really put some thought into it, and you're sort of trying to sell us on the idea of what your title sequence is going to be all about, as if we are your client and you're trying to sell us on your concept. Even though you haven't made the title sequence yet, you have to sort of conceptually get us involved in it, okay? So some of the questions you're going to try to answer are, what are some of the themes of your newly imagined movie or show? Now, we did talk about themes early on in the semester. You can go back and look at that information. If you're unsure what themes are, they're, of course, related to genres and subgenres. How do your image choices support the genre and subgenre that you chose? I just gave an example a minute ago, right? If you're trying to go for a horror theme and you're showing us all bright, sunny photographs, maybe there's a disconnect, right? So you have to make sure that things make sense for the type of mood that you are shooting for. If you plan to use audio, what do you hope that your audio choices will accomplish? It has to be something beyond, well, I thought this was cool. It has to make sense. Does it help with the personality of the piece? Does it help tell the story? Is it narratively appropriate? So really put some thought into it, right? Do you have any art or film styles in mind when you're thinking about your title sequence? And I will extend that to sort of artistic choices too, which we're going to go over today. So maybe you want the whole thing to look like a watercolor painting, or maybe you want it to be sort of stop motion animation or look like cut paper. You know, you could have a very specific style you're going for. So think about that and talk to us about what you are considering. And then, of course, anything else you'd like to tell us about your ideas for your title sequence. So this is really where you take your brainstorming creative ideas, attach them to some of the items that you've collected, and make a presentation that's going to really get us involved in your plan, okay? Now, he says here, each student will be given 5 minutes to present their research and another 5 minutes to answer questions. So during our in-class live session, whether it is in Zoom, on Zoom or in person, I'm going to go around and every student is going to basically go through their presentation. You'll have a chance to share your screen, or I can put your presentation up for you, and you'll walk us through it and be ready to answer some questions about it. So you really want to put a lot of thought into this so that you're very clear on what your ideas are and try to articulate them as clearly as possible, okay? Now, obviously, we won't be doing that until after everybody turns in this step, so we're not doing it this week, obviously. So check the due dates, you'll see when it's due, and then that following Wednesday, you guys will give your presentations, okay? Obviously, make sure your presentation is fully uploaded to Canvas so that we all have access to it, and we'll go from there, okay? All right, so that is something you're going to be working on this week. Now let's hop on over to the presentation about artistic representation, okay? Okay, so let's talk about artistic representation. We are back here with the apple. And so you're probably thinking, oh no, apples again. But the apple is a good place to start, right? So we talked about sort of steps removed from reality. We talked about photography and actual items and the narrative story. And when we were just going over sort of the general tenets of visual literacy. So artistic representation, of course, or artistic interpretation, is when an artistic media, which could be anything from colored pencils to crayons to acrylic paints to oil paints to cut paper collage to you name it, anything that is considered an artistic media, and of course all the ones I just named are non-digital, but of course digital media works too, if we could be talking about digital painting or digital collage or vector graphics or anything like that. All of those are artistic media that, when used by somebody who is an artist in a way that is skilled or exploratory or experimental, then you are adding an interpretation to the item, which is a combination of your skill as an artist and the media that you are using. So let's look at what we're talking about here. So that, of course, was a photograph of an apple, and we've seen this. This is a drawing of an apple done with either Conti crayon or regular crayon, some kind of wax-based media. And you can see that, of course, the goal here, at least by the way it's presented, was to try to make a realistic-looking apple. But of course, it's not realistic because it's done using this wax-based media, and the properties of the wax-based media is going to change the way it looks. So right off the bat, it becomes an artistic interpretation because the media that you apply to it changes the way it looks. Now here's another apple, but this is done in watercolor. Now watercolor, of course, is one of the more popular artistic medias, whether it's replicated digitally or whether it's done for real using analog, non-digital ways of doing it. A lot of people know what watercolor is and how it looks and what it's supposed to sort of feel like visually, right? And so watercolor has a very specific personality to it. In that it leaves a lot of the paper texture behind. There is sort of spaces where air comes through. And so this is an interpretation of an apple using watercolor. And so again, trying to make it look realistic, but the nature of the watercolor really changes that quite a bit. Okay, now here's a digital interpretation. This is done with a vector graphics program, probably like Adobe Illustrator. And you can see that it is certainly an artistic interpretation, and because of the nature of vector graphics, it tends to have a flat, almost cut paper kind of look. There are gradations of color, there are flat areas of color, there are very recognizable shapes like these ovals here, and nice, clean, smooth edges, as it were. Okay, now this, I'm not really sure how this one was created. This could be done through a screen printing technique, it could have been done digitally, it could be done by hand, but either way, unlike these previous ones, this one, this one, this one, where the goal of the artist was trying to make a realistic interpretation of the apple, but of course it deviates from realism because of the use of the different media. Here, this one deviates from realism on purpose. They weren't trying to make it look realistic, right? This apple is purposely done in a stylized fashion. Okay, so now let's move on from apples and we'll take a look at something else here. I think we've had enough of apples for now. So this here is a painting of a set of phone booths from New York City from around sometime in the mid-1970s. As you can see here by the sign in the upper right corner, this is right in front of Macy's department store in New York City. And so years ago, there used to be banks of large phone booths like this where you could go in with these foldable doors. They were all made from metal and stainless steel and glass. And you could go in and make your phone calls. Of course, this is in a pre-cell phone age. Now you can barely ever find phone booths anywhere. But the beautiful thing about these is that they were reflective. They were sort of shiny steel, and so they were very reflective of the environment around them. And so they made a really good subject matter for both photography and painting. Lots of photographs of these things out there. But now this style of painting is sort of a hyper-realistic type of painting, trying to capture reality as accurately as possible using oil paints, and done so in such a way that there's no real deviation from reality, and completely unlike this apple where they were trying to really make it stylized, here they were trying to make it as close to reality as possible. And so this is a different type of artistic interpretation where you're not really putting much of a spin on it. In fact, you're controlling the media, the oil paint in this particular case, so precisely that you're trying to replicate what might be as a photograph. In fact, if you were to sort of look at this painting from a little bit further away or squint your eyes a little bit, you could possibly mistake it for a photograph. It's that accurate in its depiction. So while that is an artistic interpretation, it is done so in a very almost slavish way to the reality of the original. Okay, now this sort of hyperrealism can really get to the point where it's tough to tell the difference between the painting and the photograph. In the previous one, it's very realistic, but you can still see the brush strokes. This here is a step-by-step process of a really hyperrealistic oil painting process, working from a photograph, and in the end, you really can't tell the difference from the photograph and the painting. And it's funny how it progresses, because it starts out with a typical pencil sketch, and then they start putting in some of the rough shading and blocking in certain areas, and now it starts to come together. And at this point, right about here, a lot of artists might say, okay, well, I'm done. Like, that is my painted version of this portrait of this woman. But no, they continue with more and more fine detail, making their way through the whole thing. Now, there is no attempt here to subvert the original photograph from its realistic perspective. In fact, there is a lot of effort put in to hide the artistic media, the paint. Now, this is painted using a combination of acrylics and gouache. It's done so with both brushes and airbrushes. And so there is no attempt to sort of show off the media. What's funny is if you look off to the sides of the work in progress, you can see all the test strokes where they're testing out the paint. And that, of course, shows, oh, gee, that's definitely an airbrush or a paintbrush or whatever. But as they get closer and closer to finish, especially if we look at these close-ups of the eyes, there's no distinguishability between this and a photograph, and that's kind of the goal. Now, it can be argued that this is not really an artistic interpretation at all. If anything, it's using an artistic media, sprayed or painted acrylic and gouache, to replicate a photograph. So is that an interpretation, or is that just a copy? That's something that's certainly up for debate, for sure. Now, one thing about artistic interpretation is it can happen over a long period of time as the artist's abilities change or evolve. Now, this gentleman here is Pablo Picasso. You might be familiar with him. He is long thought of as sort of the father of abstract art. Now, he did not start out as an abstract artist. He was just an artist trying to make art in a way that was representational. And so over the course of his life, he did a series of self-portraits, starting from when he was a very young man all the way up until very close to his death. And he lived a really long time, so he had a lot of self-portraits. In these self-portraits, we get to see the evolution of a couple of things. His ability in terms of drawing, his aptitude and intent in terms of using media, like how he wants to draw and the style in which he draws, and how he sees himself as a person, because of course these are self-portraits, and self-portraits are not meant to just replicate what you see in the mirror. They're also meant to sort of show how you feel about yourself. And so we're going to go through these quickly, and I'm not going to comment very much on them, but I want you to just sort of look at them and think about not only how is his drawing ability evolving and changing, but how is his view of himself changing over time. And I'm going to open up the thumbnails here and shut this down so that we can sort of see the some of the ones that are coming up as we go along here. Okay, so let's shrink this down a little bit. Okay, good. Okay, so again, this is a photograph of Pablo Picasso. This is not a drawing or a painting. I wanted you to see what he looked like sort of in real life at, a little more than middle age here. But so here is one of his first self-portraits as a very young man. He was about 18 years old here. And here he is just a little bit older, using a different media, right? The first one was a painting. This is a drawing. Here he is probably in his early 30s. Here he is a little bit older. You can see the date at the bottom. This is in 1906. Notice not only the use of different media, but the way in which he interprets anatomy. Here we are a little bit later in his life. And now you can see that he is making some attempts to abstract reality, to deconstruct reality in a way that's more geometric and flat. Now this drawing is actually later than the last one, but here he's back to a type of realism, almost like a comic book interpretation of a drawing. And now he sort of goes completely in the other direction and is almost fully flattening and abstracting reality, almost removing the third dimension. Now again, these are self-portraits, so not only think about the artistic media and how he's using it, but how do you think he is viewing himself as a person, as an artist? Because here he is getting a little older, and a little older. Now this is entirely abstract, of course, but you can still pull out the expression from the face, the body language, the color usage. What does that tell you about how he feels about himself, how he sees himself? This one here. This one here. And at this point, he's an old man. He's probably into his 70s at this point. Here he is approaching towards the end of his life. And then this is the last documented one that we have of him. It's pretty striking, right? Not only the change in his artistic style and his use of the media, but clearly how he saw himself over time changed quite a bit. Now, of course, artistic interpretation can change over time in a less dramatic way. Pablo Picasso's collections of self-portraits are very striking and some might say arresting to a certain degree. There's a lot of emotion and feeling in there. But other things can change over time in terms of representation and maybe not quite be as dramatic. We'll go to something a little lighter and airier here. We'll talk about the evolution of Mickey Mouse over time. So this is Mickey Mouse's first representation back when he was known as Steamboat Willie, before he even had the name Mickey Mouse. And you can see how he was represented originally, aside from being in black and white, because of course film at the time was in black and white. But just look at his anatomy, the way he's structured. He's missing some elements of Mickey Mouse that we know so well, right? In terms of his shoes and his clothing and all that. He does have those pants. He is wearing those same shorts, or at least something similar. And you can see how he evolves over time into a newer version and a newer version and so on and so forth. And at a certain point he gets away from the specific Mickey Mouse costume and starts wearing what you could call regular street clothes. Here he's wearing a t-shirt, here he's wearing a collared golf shirt of some kind. But now in his more modern interpretation, he's back to the Mickey Mouse clothing, just with some modern touches to it. And so the evolution of artistic interpretation has a hand in sort of the chronology of it, right? It's not just a matter of the artist who's working on it or the media that's being used or the way they perceive the item or the object, or in the case of Pablo Picasso himself. But in this case, it's a matter of just sort of changing the look to keep up with the times, right? Just to keep it current and relevant. Just to stay in the world of Disney, Winnie the Pooh is another character that's changed a lot. Now in his first interpretation, this was before Disney owned the character, in his original children's book, this is kind of what one of the early sketches looked like of Winnie and Tigger and Piglet. And then a little later on, they moved into this sort of a look, right? A little more painterly, a little more sketchy. Now we have some color and they're more recognizable. Now this is probably his most famous look after Disney acquired the property and Disneyfied him, as it were. But this was the look in his earlier films and movies and shorts and whatnot, and sort of how most people imagine what Winnie the Pooh looks like. But then at a certain point in the 1990s, they kind of modernized him with some digital renderings, him and his crew of friends. And you can see the coloring is much more three-dimensional and uses a lot of gradients and a lot of shadows and fuzzy edges, and it's maybe a little too modern of an interpretation, but it fit the times. And then of course most recently they made a live-action movie and used digital renderings of the characters as if they were real stuffed animals. And this maybe goes too far in the other direction. So it's an interesting artistic interpretation, but I'm not sure it's the right one. Okay, now one other thing to pay attention to about artistic interpretation is the use of the specific media. So we talked about use of media and trying to be realistic or unrealistic or stylized. We talk about the representation of an object over time, like Picasso's self-portraits or Mickey Mouse or Winnie the Pooh. But we also can't underplay how much media plays a role in it. So here we're back to our apple. All of these I'm about to show you are done in colored pencil. Now, colored pencil is an easy to understand art media. Even if you've never used it, you can get the concept. They're just pencils in color. And so I'm going to show you each of these, and I'm not going to say much as I go through them, but just take a look at how the colored pencil is handled differently in each interpretation, right? So this one here, we have this one, which is a little unfinished, but you get the idea. This one here, another version, this one, and this one. All done with colored pencil, all done very differently. So even though the media itself has a very specific look to it, it can be manipulated and handled in such a way by the artists that they can really be dissimilar. Now, of course, the opposite of that is the same subject matter, but different media. So this apple is done with acrylic paints on canvas. This one is done with cut paper collage. This one is done with colored pencil. It's from the previous batch we just looked at. This one is done with crayon. And this one is done with watercolor. Now, what I want you guys to think about in terms of artistic interpretation, particularly as we make our way through the semester, is that as the creator of the visual elements, whether you're an artist or a filmmaker or a designer or whatever, you have certain media and tools at your disposal, and unto themselves they have a certain look. Like colored pencil looks like colored pencil. But you can choose to use it a certain way, or you can try to use it a certain way to get a particular kind of look. Not to mention the fact you can decide, am I shooting for something that looks realistic or stylized or graphic or cartoony? So there are all these choices in the world of artistic interpretation that you, as the designer, get to make. So it's something to think about when you are working on your visual media. Okay, so that's it for today. As usual, if you need me, you know where to find me. And good luck with everything you get to do this week, and I will talk to you soon.